So I'm glad you could make it out tonight for a very topical subject. This has nothing to do with politics, although politics is tangential to it. In fact, when my son went to put this up on Facebook, they wouldn't post it at first because they thought it was a political talk, because I mentioned the Trump administration's backing of the procedure. So we made our way through that. But whether Trump had ever brought up in vitro fertilization or not, this would have been a worthwhile topic because it's, again, very pertinent, and there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding surrounding this topic, even on the part of Catholics. So we're going to look at some of the complexities of the encounter of morality with politics. Donald Trump had always campaigned on being pro-life, and indeed, during his first term, he appointed pro-life judges to the Supreme Court, and thanks be to God, Roe v. Wade was overturned, although things have not been much better with Dobbs because of the cultural situation in which we live. But he had this very, very strong support of many of the pro-life community when he ran the next time. And it was fabulous in his first administration. I've been involved in bioethics and Catholic healthcare for close to 30 years. And the Obama administration, the Biden administration were just terrible when it came to attempts on the part of the US government to interfere with the moral delivery of healthcare. They're always trying to force Catholic institutions to violate their consciences by providing abortions or surgical sterilizations, or even these mutilating surgeries on children and adults with regard to transitioning. So the Trump administration was marvelous. I mean, you even had the Department of Health and Human Services in its official documents talking about human beings existing from the moment of conception, which was just extraordinary. So his first term was very good for the pro-life movement. And as you all know, one of the main planks of the Democratic Party was that abortion should be available through the full 9 months during the Democratic convention. As horrible and as unspeakable as this is, while the convention was going on, they were providing free abortions outside the convention center and free vasectomies for men. I mean, talk about a depraved organization. And so the Democrats accused Donald Trump of being anti-IVF, in vitro fertilization. And so he tried to counter that accusation, which was false, by bearing down very heavily in support of in vitro fertilization. So, I mean, the madness and complexities of politics is not to be over exaggerated. So in his defense of his position on IVF, I mean, he became even more strong in his support of it, and even claimed that he would issue a mandate to provide IVF procedures free of charge to, and would be required on the part of employers who provided health insurance for their employees to provide it free of charge, and that the government would also see that it was provided free of charge. So it was going to be a mandate to provide for IVF to anyone who wanted it or needed it. But so the question is, since he was such a strong pro-life candidate, is IVF pro-life? And obviously he was presenting it as though it were. J.D. Vance, who you know is a recent convert to the Catholic Church, has been strongly supportive of IVF too, talking about its pro-life dimensions in bringing more children into the world. I'm sure he's a very bright fellow, this J.D. Vance, and I'm sure somebody's going to clear that up for him, and maybe he'll be able to clear it up for Trump, who on these matters is not so bright, but I think very strongly supportive of this for political reasons and for political expediency. Polls show that most people, even Catholics, think that the Catholic Church is supportive of IVF. And it seems to be obvious to most people because they know that the Catholic Church is opposed to abortion and contraception, and that's all in favor of having babies. And if a married couple is not open to having children when they do marry, the marriage is invalid. So they know how strongly the Catholic Church promotes children. It has all kinds of means to assist infertile couples. And infertility is seen as a cross that has to be borne, that the Catholic Church provides very specific counseling for couples who are suffering from infertility. One of the reasons IVF has become such an issue is that infertility is at its highest rates in the history of the United States right now. 10% of women between the ages of 15 and 44 have difficulty getting pregnant, according to the Center for Disease Control. There are a lot of reasons for that. Couples are marrying later. You're all aware of that. Women are waiting to conceive. They often have professional jobs and don't want to disrupt that too early on in their marriage. There are treatments for some diseases that actually would diminish fertility in those who are receiving those treatments. And the terrible promiscuous lifestyle of so many in contemporary America leading to venereal diseases can also quite clearly diminish fertility. In fact, chlamydia is now the most common venereal disease in this country, sexually transmitted disease. It used to be gonorrhea, but now it's chlamydia. One of the difficulties with chlamydia is people aren't aware they even have it, women. And so it severely damages the fallopian tubes and other reproductive tracts on the part of the woman, making it all the more difficult for her to become fertile. So it's a terrible cross. Infertility is a terrible cross that couples have to bear. It's a source of tremendous pain. I remember I was giving a talk one time after dinner to physicians, and I wore a pager, and that's back in the days when your pager would go off and you'd look at the telephone number. You didn't have an Apple sitting in your pocket, and then you'd go call the number, and my pager went off, and I kept lecturing, of course, and then it went off again in about 3 minutes, and I kept lecturing. By the time I was finished lecturing, it had gone off like 5 or 6 times, and I said, this has really got to be an emergency. So I got to the telephone as quickly as I could and dialed the number, and it was a friend of mine. He got on the phone, he goes, John, and I said, well, what is it, George? He says, we've been married for 5 years and we can't get pregnant. And the problem was it had just built up over the years for them, and to the point where he just had to desperately reach out to try to get some help. And so it can be a very heavy burden that parents, that married couples have to carry. So it's natural, of course, that medicine would try to find a cure somehow to infertility. And one of those attempts was in vitro fertilization, which frankly was a very significant scientific achievement. We see in Scripture all the time the difficulties of infertile women. I mean, we had Abraham and Sarah. I love this accounting of the parents of Samuel the prophet. Elkanah says to his wife, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat? And why is your heart so sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? And she goes, no. I mean, but she desperately wanted to see their love embodied in a child, and they were just incapable of having a child until God miraculously granted them Samuel. So in 1987, the church issued a document known as Donum Vitae. This was the first time the church ever addressed these kinds of issues. When the Vatican issues documents, encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, declarations, they usually take the first 2 words of the document in Latin and name the document according to those initial words. And they're usually chosen very, very carefully, because those 2 words, or maybe 3 words, depending on the document, is supposed to convey what the document's all about. Donum Vitae means the gift of life, okay? And in addressing infertility among Catholics for the first time, it had been addressed before, but this is the first time they addressed the medical attempts to overcome infertility that had just been developing. But they wanted to stress the fact that new human life is a gift from God. It's not a product that comes about through technological manipulation, even of the human sex cells. And it's hard to believe that it was almost 40 years ago that that document was issued. They probably estimate that at this point in the world, 10 million people have been brought into the world through in vitro fertilization. That's a lot of people. And probably 500,000 a year in this country. So this becomes a difficult subject for priests to talk about sometimes from the pulpit, because they probably have some people in the congregation that have been engendered by IVF, have parents out there with their children sitting beside them who have been engendered by IVF. So it becomes a difficult subject to address. I remember when Donum Vitae was first issued, a lot of people were very opposed to it because they thought, how could the church be opposed to something like in vitro fertilization, which helps people, married couples, have children? And the New York Times, Washington Post, the day Donum Vitae was issued, there was a headline and an article that said, Catholics reject Vatican birth edict. Well, first of all, it wasn't an edict. It was called an instruction, and it explained it in very careful terms. The Holy See does things that are kind of stupid sometimes, because they will issue a document like Donum Vitae, and they will send it around to the media prior to issuing it, prior to making it public. But it will be under, what's it called? Oh, come on. Where it can't be cited. It's, what's the term when they send it around to the media people? And what is it? No. Embargo. Say what? Embargoed. Who said embargoed? Huh? Okay, you get a free cup of coffee tonight. It's embargoed. So the church will send these documents out. They're embargoed, which means that the media can't cite them, quote from them, until they're actually released to the public. One of the things that happens in the secular society of our day is that the media just write stories against the document during the time that it's out there before it's actually issued to the public. So this is why the Washington Post, on the very day it was issued, could said Catholics reject Vatican birth edict, because the Vatican had given them the document and an opportunity to write stories against it. So I think it's a bad practice on the part of the Holy See. But they're very trusting and hope that people will accept the truth. But very often, I remember one of my daughters, I won't say which one, she was very upset when this document came out. She said, how could the church be so nasty as to deny people, the couples, the opportunity to have a child? And I said, look, I said, can you give me 15 minutes? And she said, are you kidding me? And I said, okay, can you give me 5? And so she sat down to the dinner table, and I just began describing the process. And I got into it for maybe 3 minutes, and she jumped out of her chair and she goes, oh, that's awful. So very often when we're faced with the necessity of explaining why the church is opposed to certain procedures, just go ahead and start explaining what the procedure's like, and it will very often just ignite this yuck factor on the part of people that are hearing it. So the church has had a difficult time addressing this issue because it seems so obvious that people would be helped by these kinds of interventions. In vitro fertilization is now probably the most common intervention to deal with infertility. But the thing is, and you ought to remember, it doesn't overcome the infertility. It's a workaround. Okay, they find that the couples are still infertile, and technicians use this procedure to engender babies in petri dishes, okay, by mixing the sex cells of the husband and wife, but they don't address the underlying cause of the infertility. They've just engendered a baby. So the first one was born in 1978, Louise Brown, I should add an E on Louis. It was Louise Brown, the first time in 1978, and the first time a child was engendered using an egg donor was in 1983. And the church judged these procedures in donum vitae, the gift of life, to be illicit because it violated the dignity of the human person in many ways. Not because the church had a law against it. The church had never even heard of the procedure until it was developed, So it's not as though this was an arbitrary law that had been in place against these kinds of interventions. The church had to reflect very deeply on this, and it does. I mean, I was talking to a man one time a Methodist from Texas, and he was running the first in vitro fertilization clinic in Texas. And he said to me, I was shocked one day that I actually got a letter from the Vatican. And he said it was on very fancy stationery and had a funny hat on it with all kinds of cords hanging from it, which was the cardinal's hat. So some cardinal had written this to him. He hardly knew what to make of it. But they said, Dear Dr. Morris, we would like to bring a delegation from the Holy See to visit your fertility clinic. And he thought, I was stunned, this Texas Methodist boy bringing a group from the Vatican. So he said, I welcomed them. And he said, we got to work. We planned a 2-day conference. And the first day we were just going to deal with the procedures and the techniques and their success rates and so on and so forth. And we had reserved the second day to discuss the morality of it. And he said, sure enough, this delegation from the Vatican showed up. And he said there was a cardinal and there was a bishop and there was a physician and a couple of theologians. And he said, we sat down to have the first session, and we were explaining the procedure to them. And he said, they stopped us and they said, well, you really don't need to do that. And he said, I found to my surprise and somewhat to my chagrin that they knew more about what was going on with procedures to overcome fertility around the globe than we did. Well, we're a global reality. The church is a global institution. So it was studying these issues very, very carefully with scientists, discussing them with theologians, and the church takes these matters, as you can well imagine, tremendously seriously, reflects on them, and then is able to provide moral guidance, not only to its members, but hopefully to all of society. So in rejecting in vitro fertilization, Donum Vitae, that document, The Gift of Life, and almost 20 years later, another one was issued on the same topic called Dignitas Personae, or the dignity of the person, insisted that the church opposes some of these assisted methods of engendering life and wanted to insist that these techniques are not to be rejected on the grounds that they're artificial. As such, they bear witness to the possibilities of the art of medicine, but they must be given a moral evaluation in reference to the dignity of the human person who is called to realize his vocation from God to be, and again, by the name of this document, our vocation is to be the gift of love and the gift of life. It's something that's given to us. It's something we don't deserve. It's something we don't make or create ourselves, okay? And, but we're not opposed to science in terms of addressing these kinds of issues. The church's concern all the time is to protect and foster the dignity of the human person. So if we look at the procedure itself, and you probably know what it is in general, gametes, or the sex cells, are procured from the man and from the woman, from the husband and from the wife. And the woman has to go through several cycles using a hyperovulatory stimulation drug. As you know, a woman has an egg mature once a month from alternating ovaries, but that would never be enough to be able to carry out this procedure. So they give her these hyperovulatory drugs, which have multiple egg follicles maturing and being able to be retrieved from the ovaries. This is not an easy thing that these women have to endure with these ovulation stimulation drugs. They can be very, very difficult. They can be painful. Sometimes they put her to bed while they're taking their effect. And the man customarily provides his semen by simply masturbating. They give him a dirty magazine and he goes in a back bathroom in the clinic and provides the sample of his sperm. These are then placed on a glass dish, a petri dish, with a nutrient-rich serum on the bottom of it, and conception takes place there. So there is the hope that as you can know, there are tens of thousands of sperm that would be floating around in the dish. They will match up with an egg, and conception will actually take place there. And then the embryos are monitored to see how they're developing, and the healthiest ones are placed in the uterus of the woman, and the others are either thrown out or they're used for experimentation, or they're frozen in liquid nitrogen to be used in a later cycle if this one is not successful. Okay. So again, it's rather simple. The eggs are removed and placed in a petri dish. The sperm is added. They come together and gender a child. It's incubated for 1 to 3 days to form these embryos. And the embryos are placed into the uterus using a tiny plastic catheter. And then they may or may not implant. Okay, so the doctors, technicians are able to get them there into the right place, but there's no guarantee that they're going to implant. Now, when they go through this procedure, they analyze the embryos. They scale them, right? So this is a level 1 embryo, level 2 embryo, and a level 3 embryo. Which one do you think is the best for implanting? Well, this is the most nicely formed. So this is the best and the healthiest embryo. So that one will be chosen to be implanted in the uterus of the woman. Those will simply be discarded because it's probably not even good enough to use for experimentation. And but you can see that from the very beginning, there's a kind of eugenics approach being used to human beings in their very origin. Okay, you're only going to pick the best ones. You're only going to pick the healthiest ones. So there are usually about 12 eggs which are retrieved after using the stimulation drug. 10 eggs typically will be suitable for fertilization, and only 3 to 4 of those will really be viable for implantation. Now, I mentioned that it's not an easy process for these women to deal with the hyperstimulation drugs. It can result in multiple fetuses which can present their own problems. It can sometimes cause ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. 14% of women develop this syndrome with a 2% risk of death. So there are risks involved in trying to use in vitro fertilization, and as usual, the ones put at greatest risk are the women, not the men. So then you have the implantation of the embryos. Some embryos are transferred after day 3, others between 5 and 7. They usually don't go much beyond that. But how many embryos are placed in the uterus with the hope that they will implant? There's no number specified. In fact, in the United States, there is absolutely no oversight or regulation whatsoever, governmental or medical, of these fertility clinics. It's like the wild, wild west. I mean, what they want to do is get the highest numbers possible of success and make a lot of money, which frankly they do. So it's up to the patient to decide how many embryos she wants to have implanted. There's almost never just one, because this is a very expensive and unpleasant experience, and they want to make sure they wind up having a baby. So they almost would never implant just one. So there's always more with the odds of a successful pregnancy. However, as you can imagine, the larger the number of embryos that are placed in the uterus, the greater the risk there will be to the mother. Do any of you remember Octomum? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in 2009, she gave birth to 8 8 babies that had been implanted through in vitro fertilization. I just read up on her today. She now has 14 children. She's never been married. She just likes having babies, I guess. I don't know where she's getting her money to support 14 children, but anyway. So, but you can, like I said, I mean, there's no other country in the world that would allow a physician to implant 8 embryos in a woman. It would be malpractice. But in this country, you know, if it's going to make you money, you can do it. So it's an unpleasant procedure for the couple. The stimulation drugs can be dangerous for the woman. It's expensive, costing between $15,000 and $20,000. That cost has been roughly the same for the last 10, 15 years, so they haven't been able to bring the cost of it down. The success rate is about 20%. So if you really want to have a baby and the success rate is 20% and you want to work toward 100%, how many embryos are you going to try to implant? Anybody? 5. Yeah, there must be a mathematician here. So there was a doctor in Canada that had implanted 5 embryos. The mother gave birth to 2 children. She didn't want 2 children. She only wanted 1. So she sued the doctor for wrongful birth, not wrongful death, but for wrongful birth. She sued him. She won, and he became responsible for the care of that child until it reached the age of 18. Now, doctors don't want to have to face that, so they're going to find ways of not having too many babies born that the mother doesn't want. So what they do, this is on a slide, but this comes up quite naturally right now. What they do is they engage in something called fetal reduction. And they monitor the embryos, and the ones that are the least healthy, they take a syringe filled with potassium chloride, they inject it into the chest cavity of the baby and kill it. And then the baby is later passed off by the mother. So these euphemisms are used to describe the most grotesque things that you can imagine. You know, Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, said in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, he said, you know, it's a good thing that they use these, how shall I say, these euphemisms to deal with the ugly things that they're doing. So instead of killing 3 babies in uterus because you don't want them, they're not the healthiest ones, we just call it fetal reduction. You know? And the Pope too, in Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, said, or they'll, rather than talking about murdering a baby or killing a baby, they'll talk about termination of pregnancy to hide the truth of things. And he said that's good because that shows deep in people's heart there's still a reality that what's being done is bad, and so they try to cover it up with other language. You know, I mean, my wife had 9 terminations of pregnancy. I mean, every time she gave birth, she terminated her pregnancy. You know, so so not, you know. Again, in the Gospel of Life, the Pope says, talk the truth, say what the truth is, use the right and proper words for it. So there are some risks to the mother. Almost 1/3 of pregnancies from frozen embryos. I mentioned some are frozen because if she goes through this first cycle and she doesn't get pregnant, then she's got frozen embryos that can be thawed and used for another attempt, right? But there are risks associated with using these frozen embryos. 1/3 of the pregnancies from them are ectopic. That means they take place outside the uterus, okay? And that can kill the woman. Frozen embryos are 17 times more likely to be an ectopic pregnancy than the use of fresh ones. A terrible way to refer to these. And in Finland, 14% of women undergoing IVF had complications requiring hospitalization. So as I've already mentioned, there are problems with multiple pregnancies. They're dangerous for the mother, it's dangerous for the other embryos, and so the doctors perform a culling procedure, if you will, to get rid of the ones that they don't want. Another thing they do too is when the embryos are still in the petri dish, they can do a genetic diagnosis of those babies, of those little embryos, to determine whether or not they're male or female, to determine whether or not they might have some genetic abnormality. And if they do, then they're simply discarded, not used. Or if you want to have a boy baby and you determine through the genetic test it's a girl, you throw the girl embryo out. Okay? So you have selection on the basis of whatever criteria you want for your child. So again, you can see the element of eugenics being built into this very process itself and those violations of the dignity of the human person. So the churches judge this to be illicit because it violates human dignity in so many different ways. You have the actions of technicians who replace the marital act, so the child's not even being engendered by the loving embrace of a husband and a wife, but rather by the manipulation of technicians. Okay? Life is every human being is equal. But an IVF baby coming into being is not treated as though it were equal in dignity to the rest of us, because the technician, those who provided the gametes, are making the determination where that child will live or die. Okay, so there's a immense power that the technicians and others exercise over that child, denying its true dignity. So in providing a moral analysis of this, Donum Vitae gave us this guidance. It said, fertilization achieved outside the bodies of the couple remains by this very fact deprived of the meanings and the values which are expressed in the language of the body and in the union of human persons. In other words, the child, again, sex is not for making babies. Sex between a husband and wife is for making love. And as they express their love for one another, a child may be given to them as a gift, right? So that's why we have to have a proper understanding of the way in which a child is intended by God, by the very natural order to come into being. It's to come into being through the expression of love for the husband and the wife. If the child is being engendered outside the body, it's not being engendered through the loving embrace of the husband and wife. It's being engendered by the manipulation of technicians. So the biggest problem, obviously, with this, there are many violations of human dignity involved in all of this. The most grave one is the taking the life of these embryos. In 1974, the church issued a document called the Declaration on Procured Abortion. The Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith is the highest doctrinal body in the church. Why do you think the Holy See would have issued a Declaration on Procured Abortion in 1974?
Because of 1973.
That's right. Roe v. Wade, the legalization of abortion in the United States, occurred in 1973. The United States, being such a prominent world power and cultural influence, posed great risks for the unborn. And so the Holy See came out with this very strong declaration on procured abortion and insisted that human life begins at conception. Human life is beginning in that petri dish, right? They stated from the time that the ovum is fertilized, a life is begun which is neither that of the father nor of the mother. It is rather the life of a new human being with its own growth. It would not be made human if it were not human already. Okay, so it's already human from the very beginning. It's not going to turn into a human being. And they went on to this perpetual evidence, that is the teachings of the church, modern genetic science brings valuable confirmation. And they went on, there is precisely a certain number of rights which society is not in a position to grant, since these rights precede society, but society has the function to preserve and enforce them. This right, the right to life, is antecedent to its recognition. It demands recognition, and it is strictly unjust to refuse it. So by the very fact of a human embryo is being, the fact that it's alive, it has this right, even while it's naked to the human eye, right? Because a human life comes into being at the moment of conception. And Pope John Paul II wrote in the Gospel of Life, to which I referred already, abortion is the deliberate and direct killing by whatever means it is carried out of a human being in the initial phase of his or her existence, extending from conception to birth. And this has been definitively taught by the Church. The Pope makes reference to this in his encyclical, again, the Gospel of Life, or Evangelium Vitae. This doctrine, that is the evil of a procured abortion, is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. No circumstance, no purpose, no law whatsoever can ever make licit an act which is intrinsically illicit, since it is contrary to the law of God, which is written in every human heart, knowable by reason itself, and proclaimed by the Church. So, in the process of in vitro fertilization and the engendering of maybe this one little baby, how many embryonic human beings have been destroyed in the process of bringing this one human being to life? Okay. And these are all examples of the killing of human beings, which can never, ever be justified under any circumstances. But again, this isn't just a church teaching. It is the insight of science. There's something in Germany called the Embryonenschutzgesetz. Now, I'd like you all to repeat that after me. Embryonenschutzgesetz. Germany has an Embryo Protection Act, if you can believe that, a law that protects the embryo. And it protects the embryo, and I'm quoting here from the law, from the moment of the fusion of the nuclei of the two gametes of the sex cells of the man and the woman. The genetic material is in the nuclei of the gametes. That's where the genetic material is going to bring about a new human being. The German law is so specific that it can describe in the law the science of what's happening. A human being has come into existence from the moment of the fusion of the nuclei of the two gametes. In Dobbs, I hate to say it, they say, well, we can't determine when human life actually begins. I mean, yes, you can. The Germans can do it. You ought to be able to do it. You know, I mean, it's a scientific fact. Like you quote all kinds of sources in your Supreme Court decisions. Cite some science. I mean, if that had been done with Dobbs, and Dobbs had said since a human being is there by scientific fact, it's entitled to protection under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But it didn't say it, unfortunately. So we read again in Dignitas Personae, which came out about 20 years after Donum Vitae, the gift of life. And again, this was the dignity of the person. And this is what happens, again, through this process, okay? This declaration of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith said, by treating the human embryo as mere laboratory material, the concept itself of human dignity is also subjected to alteration and discrimination. I've already explained some of the ways in which that's done. Dignity belongs equally to every single human being, irrespective of his parents' desires, his social condition, educational formation, or the level of physical development. Every human being has inviolable dignity, and that can never be violated. But what happens is when we're looking at it as laboratory material, we're dehumanizing it at that moment. Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a book back in 2006. He says, man, talking about these kinds of interventions and developments in human science, man is now capable of making human beings, quote unquote, producing them, quote unquote, in test tubes, he says, so to speak. Man becomes a product. And this entails a total alteration of man's relation to his own self. He is no longer a gift of nature or of the Creator God. He is his own product. And it's treated as a product. You know, if it's found defective, you simply throw it away. Pope Francis talks all the time about the throwaway culture that we're living in today, and this is a prime example of it. So the embryo comes to be seen as a product. It isn't, but we think if it's our creation, we made it, we can destroy it. It's subject to quality control. If it doesn't measure up, we throw it out. You know, married couples do not have a right to a child, which is one of the things that leads them to take unacceptable steps to try to have a child. Because a child is not a product that a couple can have a right to, okay? A child is procreated, it's not reproduced, okay? It's an important point. Human beings don't reproduce. Human beings procreate, right? Because it's the husband, it's the wife, and God that brings about a new human being. The rights that a husband and wife have, the right is the right to those acts which of their nature are ordered toward the generation of children. In other words, they have a right to have sex with one another. That's the right they have, and the right they're given when they get married. They don't have a right to have a child. And if, in their exercise of that right, a child comes about, then it comes about as a gift. In the face of this, we have to insist in the strongest terms that the IVF embryo is not a product. So there's a grave danger that the embryo might be perceived and treated as such. But the embryo, every child engendered by in vitro fertilization, and even when they're in the petri dish, is a child of God with an immortal soul and inviolable. And this is why the deaths or even killings of these embryos associated with IVF are so heinous. So Don Vitae says again, and it's been unavoidable. The connection between in vitro fertilization and the voluntary destruction of human embryos occurs too often. Man sets himself up as the giver of life and death by decree. And when this procedure was first developed, there was a lot of speculation. Well, maybe we can do it without killing embryos. Well, you can't. I mean, it's never been done. And especially since what they're seeking is high success rates, they're not concerned about the death of these, they call them spare embryos. Because human life is sacred because from its beginning, it involves the creative act of God and remains forever in a special relationship with the Creator. Human life is thus given a sacred and inviolable character which reflects the inviolability of the Creator himself, which is why we insist that the embryo has such incredible value. So the language, I'm often asked, you know, what do you see as the greatest bioethical issue that we're facing today? And I don't say something like in vitro fertilization or abortion. I see the gravest bioethical threat in our day is the depersonalization of the human being, that we no longer treat human beings as inviolable creatures with a sacred quality. Okay, with transplanted organs, we consider them to be a source of raw material, if you will, that we can draw from the weak and the vulnerable to help those who are strong and wealthy. So when we refer to these artificial reproductive technologies, we've already given over to the secularized world the language that they're using, okay? Again, because human beings don't reproduce, we procreate. Human beings not brought about by technologies, they're brought about by the loving embrace of a husband and wife. And so even the language that we use to talk about these procedures is dehumanizing. There are other abuses that obviously can arise from this. The egg or the sperm can come from one who is not a spouse. So the husband, for example, may not be able to provide sperm, so they get the sperm from somebody else and use the wife's egg. This happens all the time. Same with perhaps the wife not able to provide an egg. This obviously is a species of adultery because you're engendering a child with someone other than your spouse. It's used by lesbian and gay couples to, they can provide their gametes and have a child engendered for themselves. So there can be all kinds of abuses that arise from this. And I think if people stop and reflect on it, they naturally see the horror of it all. St. Paul writes to the Romans and says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature observe the prescriptions of the law, they show that the demands of the law are written in their hearts." You don't have to have a commandment that you shouldn't murder somebody. I mean, you ought to know that. We all know that. And I think one of the strongest examples I ever encountered on the pervasiveness of the natural law was an article I read in the New York Times. It was on the upper fold of the New York Times. And the headline was, "The Job Nobody Wants at Fertility Clinics." What do you think it is? Discarding the leftover embryos. Okay. Now these aren't Catholics working in these fertility clinics. These aren't motivated by religious conviction, but they know in their hearts that what is in this petri dish is of such transcendent value somehow that they don't want to be the ones to discard it. Okay. The discarding embryos, said the director of the clinic, is by far the least appreciated task that we do here. Embryologists from a pretty good spectrum, the embryologists form a pretty good spectrum, and no one wants to be assigned that job. So he does it. Usually the director of the clinic is the one that discards the spare embryos. There have been attempts in other countries. The U.S. is the worst in the world. There are attempts in other countries to limit the adverse effects of this procedure. For example, in Germany, Italy, and Poland, there's a law that places some limits on how this procedure is carried out to try to protect life. In those three countries, no more than 3 embryos can be engendered. They all have to be implanted, and there can be no fetal reduction. But nonetheless, it's still fraught with all kinds of violation of human dignity. The question is often asked, what about the clean case? And when Donum Vitae first came out, I debated a Jesuit, of course, at Georgetown down in Washington, D.C., and he was opposed to the church's opposition to this procedure, and obviously I was defending Donum Vitae. But he wanted to deal with the clean case. Well, there aren't any clean cases, but this is the one they tried to come up with as a clean case, where the gametes are only from the married couple. The male sperm is not obtained from masturbation. Only 1 or 2 embryos are engendered. Both are implanted. There's no fetal reduction. And so can't we just do a clean case like this? Well, the problem is no fertility clinic is going to do the clean case because they're not going to be able to generate enough embryos and have sufficient success rates to make a lot of money. But the other thing is, nonetheless, you're still treating human beings as products, as not your equal in dignity. There's still going to be the loss of human life, and you're still using eugenic determinations with regard to even determining the eggs that will be used. So Dignitas Prosernae goes on and says, which I think very nicely, behind every no there's a yes. Behind every no in the difficult task of discerning between good and evil, there shines a great yes to the recognition of the dignity and inalienable value of every single and unique human being called into existence. So there can be all kinds of good that can be carried out by a couple facing fertility problems. So Donum Vitae went on and talked about the difference between assisting and replacing. So it's legitimate to go ahead and use methods to overcome infertility that assist the marital act in achieving its end. It's just you can't replace the marital act. Okay, so it's a very simple distinction. It becomes sometimes difficult in its application. But Donum Vitae says, if the technical means facilitates the conjugal act or helps it to reach its natural objective, it can be morally acceptable. If, on the other hand, the procedure were to replace the conjugal act, it is morally illicit. Quite straightforward. So the fundamental principle, again, is the intervention helps the marital act to achieve its natural end. It can be licit. It may be licit, and if the intervention replaces the marital act, it is illicit. And this is all the U.S. The Catholic Church is the largest provider of health care in this country after the government. I don't know if you knew that. But to oversee this vast ministry, the bishops of this country issue something called the Ethical Religious Directives of Catholic Healthcare Services that deal with all the do's and don'ts that can take place in Catholic healthcare institutions. And there's a directive that addresses this. When the marital act of sexual intercourse is not able to attain its procreative purpose, assistance that does not separate the unitive and procreative ends of the act and does not substitute for the marital act itself may be used to help married couples conceive. And there are moral interventions that can be used. For example, sometimes a couple is facing infertility because the husband can't have an erection. So it would be perfectly legitimate to use Viagra, for example. There can be a prosthesis that can be placed in the penis of the man that can actually be pumped up to attain an erection so that he can carry out the marital act. Sometimes there's something called a micropenis where the penis is so small it's not able to deposit the sperm close enough to the cervical os, and so a cervical spoon might be used to collect the semen and to move it further up closer to the cervical os. Sometimes there are blockages in the fallopian tubes or the vas deferens in the man that can be surgically removed. Hyperovulatory stimulation drugs can be used, for example, if a woman's not bringing enough eggs to maturity, but it has to be used in a very careful way because you don't want to have too many eggs engendered so that you have too many multiple pregnancies resulting from it. But that can be used to try to address one of the problems that is faced. Endometriosis is a very common disease that women have that can be addressed through surgery. And then there's one which is naprotechnology, which was developed at the Paul VI Institute at Creighton University out in Nebraska. And this monitors the woman's cycle very, very carefully and all the symptoms that are associated with that cycle to determine what the problem might be naturally that might be able to be addressed naturally. In this country, we generally want a problem to be fixed quickly. This requires a lot of time to go through various cycles, so IVF is quick and easy. Natural family planning is based on the same principles. They don't talk so much about natural family planning anymore as fertility awareness-based methods of regulating births. But all of those deal with the natural cycles that a woman goes through and monitoring them. So I'm going to finish up with what I call mandate madness. And God help him, Trump has proposed mandating IVF treatments to insurance companies and funds being provided by the federal government or by employers at no cost to the employees. We went through this under the Obama years. We had the Obama contraceptive mandate under the Affordable Care Act. And that was hardly passed at all before they came up with this contraceptive mandate. I think it was targeted at nobody other than Catholics because we were the only ones generally in this country that had that still as an issue. But in 2012, the Affordable Care Act required that the government and all health plans provided by employers would have to cover contraception for all employees, which was madness. I mean, they had the Little Sisters of the Poor being mandated to provide contraception for their employees and for the other sisters that were on the health plan, even though they were at no risk of getting pregnant. So the church and its many institutions had to sue the government. The Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. was the first, along with the Little Sisters of the Poor, to sue the Obama administration. We had to clean up. We never had to use an attorney, but we had to fight this mandate from the Obama administration. I can't tell you the difficulties that caused and the amount of money that was spent on legal fees to try to protect the consciences of Catholic institutions and employers. I mean, you had employers that weren't a Catholic institution as such, but they had their own company and they weren't going to provide that for their employees. It was a mess. And now Trump comes up with an IVF mandate, which would be equally unjust. It would be fundamentally a mandate for abortion, because I've already indicated how many deaths there are associated with IVF. In a sense, if Trump mandated it would be worse than the Obama contraceptive mandate, because there would be untold numbers of children, embryonic children, who would die. And so Catholics might be forced to sue the Trump administration over this. He just doesn't know. He just, he's well-intended. We know that. And I'm just hoping that J.D. Vance can pound some sense into his head. And of course, it concludes with this, but the dilemma of frozen embryos. We've got millions of frozen embryos on liquid nitrogen. What do we do with them? And when I used to be the president of something called the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and when we had programs on these kinds of issues, the burning question for most of the Catholics who would attend these would be, what are we going to do with the frozen embryos? There's really not much we can do with the frozen embryos. You can continue paying the storage fees to keep them in suspended animation in liquid nitrogen, but virtually every attempt to resolve it doesn't work morally. I mean, what do? Well, you can thaw them and use them in experimentation. Well, you're not going to do that. Can you baptize them? You try to baptize them, you kill them. I mean, you could be killing them through the procedure of baptism. Can you use them for embryo adoption? Can we rescue them? Dignitas Personae addressed this with regard to infertile couples, saying that this is one of the proposals that was put out there, that infertile couples could adopt these frozen embryos. And the Holy See said the proposal that these embryos could be put at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility is not ethically acceptable, for the same reasons which make artificial heterologous procreation, won't get into that, illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. This practice will also lead to other problems of a medical, psychological, and legal nature. And of course, one of the things is if we approved this for infertile couples, it's not a treatment for their infertility. Again, it's a workaround, and to thaw embryos for this procedure, some of them will die during the thawing process. Once they've been thawed, then you're going to be making eugenic kind of decisions as to which ones we're going to try to implant and which ones not. We've just walked into a moral morass that really has no resolution. And so this is why we ought to avoid in vitro fertilization and why it's not really pro-life. So any questions?